The data came back from a dead region of space, and nobody on Earth slept well that night. Petra Solis had been running deep-range probes for 3 years from a listening post near the galactic edge. She was not looking for monsters. She was mapping gravitational drift patterns for a geology paper that nobody would ever read. But the numbers that came back on a Tuesday morning did not belong to any known star system, any known force, any known anything. They belonged to something that was eating stars. She reported it up the chain. The chain passed it to Admiral Rael Dorn, a man who had spent 22 years in Earth's unified space fleet and another 18 trying to get the galactic conclave to treat humanity like adults. Rael looked at the data for 6 hours straight. He called Petra. He asked her 3 questions. She answered all 3 in ways that made his stomach drop. Then he closed the channel and stared at the wall. The thing in the data was moving, not fast by galactic standards, but steadily, deliberately, without pause. It passed through a system and the system went quiet. No signals, no planets, no star, just silence. Rael named it exactly that, the silence. He took the findings to the Conclave Grand Assembly on Vornes Prime, the great station world where 31 species sat in rings of carved stone and debated the shape of the galaxy. Rael had been to this chamber many times. He had always felt small here. The Vorn, the dominant species, had insect-like faces and 3,000-year-old institutional memory, and they had a way of looking at humans that suggested mild amusement at a pet that had learned a new trick. Rael did not perform for them. He simply placed the data on the table and walked them through it, point by point, in a calm and even voice. He showed them where the silence had been. He showed them where it was going. He showed the estimated timeline, 14 months before it reached the first inhabited systems. He sat down. High Speaker Drevak of the Vorn rose slowly. His translated voice carried the particular tone of a being who had never been surprised by anything. He said the data was noise. He said human instruments were imprecise. He said humanity had been in space for 100 years, and the Vorn had been watching the cosmos for 30,000, and perhaps it was not the best use of the Assembly's time to chase shadows cast by a species still learning to count stars. Several delegates laughed, not all of them. The Tavari ambassador, a quiet aquatic being named Suli, did not laugh. Neither did the Murath representative, who was made of something closer to stone than flesh, and who communicated in low vibrations that the translators rendered as worried murmurs. But they were small voices. The vote was 28-3 to table the matter and move on. Rael gathered his materials. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He walked out of the chamber, down the long corridor of carved alien stone, and boarded his ship. He sat in the pilot's chair for a long time before activating the engine. When he arrived back at Earth, Secretary-General Ashav Vane was waiting for him at the dock. She had already read the transcript. She was not a tall woman, but she had the kind of stillness that made rooms feel smaller around her. She looked at Rael and said quietly, "We warned them. Now we prepare." Rael nodded. He thought of Petra's data, of the dead systems, of the way the silence moved. He thought of 28 alien delegates who had laughed or looked away. He thought, they will remember this vote. That night, Earth's Joint Defense Council met in a sealed facility below the Ural Mountains. No record of the meeting was transmitted to the conclave. The first classified order under Project Rampart was signed before sunrise. It authorized the full activation of assets that the conclave did not know existed. Humanity had spent 40 years in the conclave playing a careful game. The game was over. In her listening post at the edge of charted space, Petra Solis watched the new probe feeds. The silence had moved again. 3 more light years. A cluster of small rocky worlds that used to reflect sunlight now reflected nothing. She marked the updated position on her map. She thought about the conclave delegates who had laughed. She was not angry. She was something colder than angry. She was certain. She pulled up a new file and began writing the final version of her report, not for the conclave this time, but for Project Rampart's science division. In it, she wrote one line that would later be quoted in every account of what followed. "It does not conquer, it digests." She saved the file, sealed it with a military-grade cipher, and sent it to Rail's secure terminal. Then she made herself a cup of something warm and sat in the quiet of her post, listening to the hum of instruments, watching the darkness at the edge of the galaxy where the stars were going out one by one. 14 months, possibly less. Earth was already moving. 3 weeks after the conclave vote, a cargo hauler registered to a private mining firm docked at an orbital platform above Mars. The crew filed standard paperwork. The customs inspector stamped it without looking closely. The cargo listed on the manifest was industrial coolant. It was not industrial coolant. It was the first batch of Godspear components, a weapon that officially did not exist, being transported to a construction bay that was not on any public chart, to be assembled by engineers who had signed agreements that used the word permanent in several uncomfortable places. That was how Earth moved, quietly, under cover of ordinary things. Rail spent those 3 weeks in motion, from Earth to Mars to the Outer Fleet assembly point near Jupiter's shadow, where ships that the conclave believed were decommissioned were being recommissioned at a rate no one outside Project Rampart knew about. The conclave's intelligence on Earth's military capability was old, deliberately old. Humanity's strategic planners had understood something 40 years ago, when they first sat down at the conclave table and realized how the game was played. Never show a powerful stranger everything you have. So they had not. The fleet that the conclave knew about had 80 ships. The fleet now quietly powering up across 3 hidden staging areas had 600. They were not decorative cruisers. They were built on a philosophy of war that no alien civilization had ever needed to develop, because no alien civilization had spent 10,000 years fighting itself. Humanity had learned things about conflict that the Vorn, in 30 centuries of peaceful dominance, had never been forced to learn. How to build ships that were ugly and functional and almost impossible to kill. How to coordinate 10 things at once under pressure. How to lose badly and come back. Rail met with engineer Davy Oren in a pressurized bay on the Mars platform, standing beside the partially assembled frame of Godspear. Davy was a thin man with oil on his hands and the look of someone who had not slept voluntarily in years. He explained the weapon simply. It generated a focused gravitational collapse. At full power, it could fold the space around a moon-sized object until the object ceased to occupy space. It had never been tested at full scale, because testing it at full scale would probably destroy the testing site and everything near it. Rail asked how long to finish it. Davy said 4 months if nothing went wrong. Rail told him to assume something would go wrong and plan for 3. Davy made a face. Rail walked away. Meanwhile, the conclave convened a follow-up review committee to assess whether humanity's data deserved a second look. The committee had 17 members, met twice, produced a report with 400 pages and no conclusions, and recommended further study. The Murath representative sent a private message to Earth's diplomatic channel asking, in their slow vibrational way, whether humans were genuinely alarmed. Rail answered personally. He sent Petra's updated maps. The Murath received them and went very quiet. The Tavari ambassador Suli did something different. She appeared at Earth's embassy on Vornes Prime at an odd hour, wearing no formal robes, carrying nothing, and asked to speak to whoever was actually in charge. Earth's ambassador connected her to a Shavane. The two spoke for 2 hours on a secured line. What was said was never officially recorded. What was known afterward was that Suli returned to the Tavari homeworld and quietly recommended that the civilian population consider moving toward underground shelter systems for reasons related to seismic preparedness. The Tavari had no active volcanoes. 11 weeks after the conclave vote, the Murath outer colonies went dark, not all at once. One station, then a mining post, Then the relay tower connecting 3 settlements. Then silence. The Murath sent fragmentary distress signals to the conclave, but the signals were difficult to interpret because Murath communication was always slow, and their distress looked, to non-Murath ears, like ordinary geological data. By the time a Vorn signals officer identified the pattern, 4 days had passed. The conclave convened an emergency session. Drevak announced it with the carefully managed gravity of a being who needed to seem like he had always taken this seriously. He proposed sending the Vorn First Battle Armada to investigate 400 ships, the largest single military force in conclave history. The vote was unanimous. Humanity abstained. Rael watched the Armada depart from a feed on his terminal. He said nothing. Petra, standing beside him, said nothing. They both knew what the Armada was flying toward. They both knew what 400 Vorn ships represented against something that had swallowed star systems without slowing down. Davy Oren sent a progress report that same evening. Godspear was ahead of schedule. Something, for once, had not gone wrong. 6 hours after the Armada dropped out of FTL near the Murath outer zone, the signals stopped. Not combat reports, not damage assessments, not a last transmission, just nothing. The conclave tracking stations watched 400 beacons go dark in sequence, like lights being turned off in an empty building, until the last one blinked out and the display showed only static. Ashav Vane read the report at her desk at 3 in the morning. She sat still for a while. Then she called Rael. He picked up before it rang twice. She said, "It is time." Yes. Conclave had never issued an emergency appeal to all member species before, not once in 3,000 years of recorded galactic governance. The document that went out was written in formal Vorn diplomatic language, which meant it was long and indirect and buried its actual desperation under 17 layers of procedural phrasing. But the meaning was clear. The Vorn fleet was gone, the threat was real, and the conclave needed help from anyone who had any help to give. Most species had nothing to give. The conclave structure had always kept military power concentrated in Vorn hands. Other species had patrol vessels, border guards, and ceremonial escorts. They had never needed more because the Vorn had always been enough. Now the Vorn had sent their best and their best had ceased to exist, and 30 remaining species were looking at each other with the expression of people who have just realized the thing they relied on is gone. Rael received the appeal on a secure line. He read it once. He set it on the table and poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. Then he opened a channel to the Grand Assembly. Every seat was occupied. He had never seen the chamber full before. Normally, species sent junior delegates to sessions that humans attended. Now the senior members were there, and they were not managing their expressions well. He spoke without notes. He told them that Earth had reviewed the appeal. He told them humanity was willing to lead the defense of conclave space, but that the word lead was not a polite gesture. It meant what it said: human command, human strategy, allied forces operating under human coordination without argument, without delay, without committee review of tactical decisions. If any species could not agree to that, Earth would defend Earth and leave the rest to fate. The silence that followed was different from the silence 3 months ago when they had laughed at Rael's warning. That silence had been comfortable. This one was the sound of 30 species understanding, perhaps for the first time, that they had profoundly misread something. Drevak spoke last. His voice came through the translator in the same measured tones as always, but something in the cadence was different. He said the Vorn conclave formally accepted humanity's terms. Rael cut the channel. 40 minutes later, 600 ships dropped out of FTL at 11 separate coordinates simultaneously. Not in a line, not in a cluster. Spread across 3 dimensions in a pattern that covered every approach vector to the core systems, each group positioned to support the others, each running on targeting solutions calculated days in advance and updated in real time by the system Rael's people called the conductor. The conductor was humanity's fleet AI, not a single machine but a distributed network threaded through every ship in the fleet. It did not make decisions. It made coordination possible at a speed no organic being could match. 600 ships moved like one animal. When the first edge of the silence appeared on long-range sensors, a mass the size of a small moon moving in a slow consuming spiral, the conductor had a firing solution before any human officer had processed the visual. 20 minutes later, the mass was gone. Conclave observers on an allied Tavari vessel watched the engagement and did not speak for a long time. Sully, who was aboard, finally said to the officer next to her, "They were never small. They were waiting." The officer, young and still visibly shaken, asked what that meant. Sully said, "It means we are very lucky that their patience did not run out before ours did." A Murath stone delegate on a different ship experienced something that, in Murath physiology, corresponded to what a human would call tears. The vibrations it produced were low and slow. The translator rendered them as, "They came." Rail established Fortress Line Kappa, a three-dimensional defensive perimeter spanning 3 star systems, designed not as a wall but as a funnel. Anything entering from the drift would be channeled toward a central kill zone, where the conductor's fire coordination was densest. Allied conclave ships were placed in support positions. Rail's staff spent 6 hours explaining human tactical doctrine to alien officers who had studied war only in historical texts. One Vorn officer named Drath, who had survived the Armada's destruction because his ship had suffered an engine failure and been left behind, asked Rail during a briefing why human ships were so much heavier than necessary for their rated weapons. Rail looked at him and said, "Because we designed them to survive being wrong." Drath did not understand at first. Then he did. He said nothing for a while. Then he asked if he could review the human hull composition specifications. Rail told him to talk to the engineering division. The first real probe attack came 48 hours later. 40 tendrils of the silence, each one a structure the size of a moon, crossed into Fortress Line Kappa's outer zone. The conductor designated targets in milliseconds. The fleet fired. 17 minutes later, 40 targets were gone, not wounded, not retreating, gone. Conclave ships in support positions reported something afterward that took the translators several attempts to render accurately. The closest approximation was stunned reverence. A Vorn tactical officer transmitted a single line to his command post. "We did not know. We did not know at all." Rail read the transmission on his screen. He thought about a chamber full of delegates laughing. He thought about Petra's data sitting on a table being called noise. He did not say anything. He forwarded it to a Shavane with no comment attached. She replied with 2 words, "Keep going." Nobody told the people of Earth that the war would be easy. Rail had given one broadcast before the fleet deployed, and it was not a speech designed to comfort. He had looked into the camera and said that humanity was going to fight something that had never been fought, with weapons that had never been tested in a war that nobody had prepared for, and that some of the people watching would lose someone before it was over. He said he was sorry for that. He said it was still worth doing. The response from Earth's civilian population was not despair. Recruitment offices reported lines forming before sunrise the day after the broadcast. 3 universities suspended their engineering programs temporarily because too many students had volunteered to work in the Rampart production lines. An old woman from a city on the coast sent a message to Rail's public account. It said, "My grandson is on one of your ships. Bring him back if you can. If you can't, make sure it meant something." Rail kept that message on a card in his jacket pocket for the rest of the war. The silence did not behave the same way twice. After the first engagement at Fortress Line Kappa, it changed. Not immediately. There was a pause of nearly 4 days where nothing moved, and Petra spent those days staring at sensor feeds with the focused expression of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. When it dropped differently. Instead of mass tendrils, The silence sent dozens of smaller protrusions simultaneously across a front 3 times wider than before. The conductor adapted. The fleet adapted. But the wider front meant some protrusions reached second-line defenses, and second-line defenses had a higher proportion of Allied conclave ships, and Allied ships, despite 6 hours of doctrine briefings, still sometimes hesitated in ways that cost seconds, and seconds in this kind of fight cost ships. 47 Allied vessels were lost in the second major engagement. No human ships. Rail noted the disparity in his report and said nothing about it publicly, but he quietly rotated human ships into the second line and moved Allied vessels further back. Drath noticed the change and came to Rail privately. He said the Vorn did not need to be protected. Rail said this was not about protection. It was about placing the right tools in the right positions. Drath looked at him for a long moment and then said in a quieter voice, "We are not the right tools, are we?" Rail said, "Not yet." Then he went back to his display. Petra's breakthrough came during the 3rd week. She had been running analysis on every engagement record, looking for anything consistent in how the silence moved, not its tactics, which changed, but its instincts. She found it in the gaps. There were specific gravitational resonance frequencies that the silence consistently avoided. Small detours, barely noticeable in isolation, that formed a clear pattern when mapped across all engagements. She brought the data to Rail at an odd hour, when the command deck was running on a skeleton crew and the lights were dimmed. She put her findings on the main display and walked him through them without preamble. Rail looked at it, he said, "It is scared of something." Petra said, "Or it remembers something that scared it, something very old, something that hit it hard enough that the memory is still in its behavior after however many millions of years this thing has been alive." Rail asked if Godspear's frequency could be modulated to produce that resonance signature. Petra said she had already called Davy about it. Davy's response, transmitted 20 minutes later, was, "You want me to retune a gravitational collapse weapon to make a specific sound that reminds a billion-year-old cosmic organism of the worst thing that ever happened to it." A pause. "I need 4 days and someone to bring me food." The 3rd major engagement hit before Davy finished. The silence came at Fortress Line Kappa from 2 directions at once, a flanking movement that no one had expected, because the assumption had always been that something consuming rather than conquering would not bother with strategy. The assumption was wrong. The eastern flank held, the western flank broke. Rail called the retreat in exactly the voice he used for everything else, calm, clear, without hesitation. The conductor pulled ships back in sequence, each group covering the next, no panic in the movement, just physics and timing executed at machine precision. Rail watched ships die on the tactical display. He watched crew manifests update with red markers. He kept his face still. Fortress Line Kappa was gone. 47 human ships lost. 90 Allied vessels. The people on all of them would not see what came next. The silence advanced into the space behind the line and then, unexpectedly, paused again. Longer this time. Its forward mass was smaller than before the engagement. Something in the fighting had cost it something. Rail noted that in his report. Petra noted it in hers and added a single line. "It can be made to pay. We have to be willing to make it pay." Davy finished the Godspear modification on day 3 instead of day 4. He transmitted the calibration data and one accompanying message. "It will work or it will be the most spectacular engineering failure in human history. Either way, interesting." Rail set up Fortress Line Omega, one system from the Conclave's core worlds. Every remaining ship, every drone, every Allied vessel that could still move. He told his crew what was coming and what Omega meant, and that there would be no line after this one. He sent a short message to a Shavane, not a broadcast, a direct line. It said, "We are at the last line." She replied in 4 words, "Then make it count." Plan was not complicated. The complicated part was making the silence believe it. Petra had designed the lure herself, a false energy signature broadcast from 3 relay buoys placed at precise coordinates, a pattern that read on any sufficiently ancient sensor system as a dense cluster of life-rich worlds. Stars packed close, planets warm and full, the kind of target that something consuming its way across the galaxy would find impossible to pass. She described it to Rael as bait that smells like everything it has ever wanted. She said it without a smile, because the situation did not call for smiling, but there was something in her voice that was close to satisfaction. The 3 Godspear ships, modified capital vessels with their standard weapons stripped out to make room for the gravitational collapse emitters, moved into position 2 days before the engagement. Their escape systems were triple-checked by Davy Oren personally, who did not trust anyone else to do it, and said so loudly to anyone who tried to tell him the schedule was too tight. Fortress Line, Omega stretched across the defensive perimeter in 3 dimensions, every ship at maximum readiness, the conductor threading targeting solutions between all 600 active hulls and the 212 Allied vessels that had survived to this point. Drath had spent 2 weeks drilling his Vorn crews on human coordination protocols. He told Rael before the engagement, "We understand now why you train the way you train." Rael said, "Stay on Channel 7 and do exactly what the conductor tells you." Drath said he would. He meant it. The silence arrived at the edge of the engagement zone and stopped. 3 minutes. Petra watched it without breathing. Something in those 3 minutes looked different, less like a predator moving and more like a predator thinking. She noted it in her log and said nothing to Rael because he had enough to track. Then the silence moved toward the lure. It moved the way it always moved, slow, immense, absolute, but in a direction that took it away from Omega's center and toward the false cluster. The buoys held the signal steady. The silence filled the sensor display like a dark tide, its leading mass larger than most moons, trailing behind it a sphere of dead signal where nothing broadcast and nothing received. Rael waited until the mass was fully inside the designated pocket. He looked at Petra. She nodded. He gave the order. All 3 Godspear ships fired simultaneously. What happened next had never happened anywhere in the galaxy in recorded history. The gravitational collapse emitters produced a resonance field that expanded outward in a visible ripple, not visible in normal light, but visible on every electromagnetic sensor, a shockwave of warped space that rolled through the pocket like a stone dropped in still water. On the sensor feeds, it looked like the universe flinching. The silence reacted. The mass twisted in ways that mass should not be able to twist. Sections of it went still. Other sections moved faster, as if trying to escape the parts of themselves that had stopped. On the tactical display, it looked like watching something very large and very ancient experience, for the first time in its existence, something it could not absorb. Petra said quietly, "That is what heard it before, something a long time ago, we just reminded it." The silence retreated, not all at once, in pieces, pulling back from the pocket, pulling back from the perimeter, moving away in the direction it had come from, back toward the drift, back toward the dead regions where it had originated. Cheers went through the fleet. Humans shouted. Alien officers produced sounds their translators described as joy, relief, and something with no direct translation, rendered as the feeling of surviving the thing you were certain would kill you. Drath transmitted one line from the absolute measure. "It runs." He said it like he still could not fully believe it. Rael did not cheer. He watched the display for 30 more seconds. Then he said, "We follow it." Several officers looked at each other. Petra looked at him from across the deck. He explained it once to everyone on the channel. A wounded predator that retreats comes back. It heals, it adapts, it returns. The silence had consumed star systems before humans reached space. If it retreated today and they let it go, it would be someone else's problem in 1,000 years, and that someone else might not have a Godspear. The galaxy had one chance to end this. He intended to take it. Nobody argued. The pursuit lasted 9 days. Godspear fired twice more, once to destroy a fragment that had turned back, and once in the deep drift where the main mass had slowed as if beginning to recover. The second shot found the center of the largest remaining structure. It came apart quietly, piece by piece over several hours, until the sensors showed nothing but cooling mass and the absence of motion. On the 10th day, Petra ran a full-spectrum scan 3 times. Her report said, "No signal consistent with the silence detected in any monitored frequency. No motion patterns observed. The threat appears to have been eliminated." Rail read it standing on the command deck with every crew member on shift watching him. He looked up from the screen and said, "It is done." The sound that followed was not a cheer. It was deeper. It was 600 ships releasing something they had been holding for a very long time. Davy transmitted from the Godspear lead vessel. "I would like to note for the record that nothing exploded that was not supposed to." Then he went asleep for 14 hours. Rail arrived at Vornes Prime on a ship with no military markings. He had done this deliberately. The Grand Assembly was in full session, every seat filled, every species present, and the atmosphere in the great carved chamber was something that took him a moment to identify. It was not celebration. It was not relief. It was the atmosphere of beings who had all, recently, understood that they were wrong about something important, and were now working out what to do with that understanding. Rail walked to the center of the chamber alone. No staff. No translator, because he was going to speak in the common conclave language he had been practicing for 22 years, and he was going to say exactly what he meant. He said humanity had warned them. He said they had voted to ignore the warning. He said Earth had then done what Earth does, prepared in silence, planned without permission, and fought when the time came. He said 47 human ships were gone, and the names on those ships were now on a wall on Earth that would stand long after everyone in this chamber was dead. He said Earth had not saved the galaxy to be owed something. The only thing he wanted was honesty. For every species in this assembly to be honest with itself about what had happened, what had been dismissed, and what the cost of that dismissal had been. He said, "We do not want your thanks, we want you to remember." He sat down. The assembly was quiet for a long time. What followed in the next 3 months was not quick or clean, because nothing involving 31 species and 3,000 years of political structure ever is. But it happened. The Vorn monopoly on conclave military power was formally dissolved. A new defense charter was drafted, debated, revised many times, and eventually signed, with Earth holding permanent co-chair status on the Security Council. The charter included a provision that no warning from any member species regarding an external threat could be tabled without a full, independent review. The provision was informally called the Dorn Clause, though Rail never acknowledged the name in public. Drevek requested a private meeting on the last day of the charter proceedings. He came without aides, without the formal attire of the High Speaker's office. He sat across from Rail in a small room and looked at him with the expression of someone who has thought carefully about what they want to say and is still not sure it is enough. He asked, "How long were you ready?" Rail considered the question. He said, "We were never not ready." Drevek was quiet. Then he said, "That is the most frightening thing I have ever heard." Rail said, "I know." Neither said anything else. Eventually Drevek stood, offered a gesture of formal respect that Rail had not seen directed at a human before, and left the room. Back on Earth, the Wall of Stars was completed. It stood in a wide open plaza in the city that had served as Earth's wartime administrative center. The wall was black and smooth, and the names were carved in standard script, each name the same size as every other, because no one had died more importantly than anyone else. Petra stood in front of it for a long time. Davy stood beside her with his hands in his pockets. They did not talk. There was nothing to say that the wall did not already say better. Asha Vane gave a short speech at the dedication. She said these names were the cost of other people's certainty. She said certainty was the most dangerous thing in a galaxy full of unknowns. She said Earth would not forget, and she hoped the galaxy would not forget either. Species that had never visited Earth sent delegations, not diplomats but researchers, students, officers, historians. They came to understand what they had misread and how. The Tavari sent young strategic planners who spent 6 months embedded with Earth's defense staff. The Murath sent a delegation that stood in various locations and vibrated at frequencies the translators described as deep respect. A Vorn Academic Institute quietly requested access to humanity's pre-conclave military history archives. Rael approved it without comment. Davy went back to engineering. He had 17 new ideas the war had given him, none of them weapons. He submitted a proposal to the Conclave Science Division for a joint gravitational resonance research project and received immediate approval and more funding than he had asked for. He seemed, for the first time in years, genuinely content. Petra stayed at her listening post. She expanded her probe network, pushed it further into regions no one had mapped. She was not looking for threats. She was doing what she had always done, watching, recording, mapping. She trusted that if something was out there, the data would find it. Several months after the Wall of Stars was dedicated, something new appeared in her feeds. A different region, a different edge of the galaxy, different signature, different movement pattern, but the same quality of wrongness she had learned to recognize. She sat with it for a while, ran the verification checks twice. Then she opened a secure channel to Rael's office and waited. He picked up on the second signal, which meant he had been awake. She said, "I have something." A pause, then, "Show me." She transmitted the data. She heard him breathing while he looked at it. Then he said, in the same voice he used for everything, calm, clear, already planning, "Well, at least this time no one will tell us we are wrong." Petra looked at her display. The readings pulsed slowly in the dark at the edge of the galaxy. She said, "No, they will not." She closed the old report and opened a new one. Earth was already moving.